Well, welcome everybody. Are you as anxious as I am to hear from the amazing author and brewer Michael Tonsmeire? Well, we're going to get to hear about brewing light, small table beers. I'm Doug Piper, and I'm the host of the Gourmet Brewing channel. I'm in Greenville, South Carolina, in the USA, and I want to thank you all for taking time because we strive to make your day more delicious, one sip at a time. And let me tell you a little bit about Michael. Michael is a well-respected brewer and co-founder of Sapwood Cellar Brewery in Columbia, Maryland. And with his profound expertise in brewing, he earned the nickname the Mad Fermentist. I'll have to get a better story on the mad part. But anyway, for his innovative approach to fermentation and experimentation in craft beer. And in addition, he's also the author of the American Sour Beers Innovative Techniques for Mixed Fermentations. That's a book that's highly regarded as a definitive guide in the realm of sour beer production. Michael shares his knowledge in his blog, The Mad Fermentist, where he educates on various brewing techniques and fermentation processes and recipes. This work has cemented him as a cemented status. I'll try that again. His work has cemented his status as a key figure in the craft beer community. I really flubbed that up pretty good, but anyway, you get the idea. Especially in the domain of sour and mixed fermentation. Now, as I have researched this exciting webinar, I realized I didn't fully understand all the words associated with lower ABV beers. So how would you contrast regular beer versus light and other aspects of lesser beers, whether they be craft beers or whatever? How are they similar and how are they different?
Sure. First, thanks for having me. Light beer was really something that grew out of diet beer. Diet beer was something that the big breweries really didn't think was selling well to their target demographic, mostly men. And so they came up with light beer, and sort of the sales pitch became, you can drink more of it. It's not a lighter flavor. It's just a little lower alcohol, a little bit lower calorie. But that's not a new invention. That's something that's been part of the brewing scene for as long as there's been beer. There were always table beers, which just meant something that was really low alcohol that you could essentially drink all day long while you were working in the field because water wasn't potable, and a 1 or 2% alcohol beer was something that was safe to drink. And that grew into things like session beer in England. It grew into just sort of the everyday drinking beers of Germany, Belgium, the Czech Republic that were often 3, 4, 5% alcohol. And those beers have all sort of turned into their own styles. You know, a Berliner Weiss isn't a light version of another style. It's just a low alcohol sour beer that is in and of itself low alcohol, light, refreshing. And really, that's sort of what we've seen come about in America as people want to drink beer. I mean, that's sort of the biggest issue for me. I want to drink more beer. All things being equal, I'd rather drink 2 beers or 3 beers rather than 1 beer. And so if I can craft a beer that has as much flavor, the body, and all I'm sacrificing is the alcohol, I can have 2 3% beers rather than 1 6% beer. I can have 1 6% stout rather than having a imperial stout, a half an imperial stout. But that's really a challenge. Just by its very nature, beer and malt and alcohol has a lot of intrinsic flavor, and you can't just pull out half of the carbohydrates and half of the alcohol and expect it to taste the same. I know Mike McDowell, who isn't with us anymore, would always talk about making a light lager just by having seltzer water on tap in his kegerator. And if he wanted to make a light lager, he'd have a pour of his American, standard 5% lager and add 1/3 seltzer water, and that would get him to a place he was happy with. But that really does make a lighter beer, both in flavor, in alcohol, in body and mouthfeel. And that works for a light lager, but that might not work for making, say, an English mild or a wit beer or another sort of intrinsically low alcohol style.
But so Michael, what is the challenge then? What if you want a light IPA? You were talking about, Charlie Papazian was telling me about this, that he's frustrated that when he goes to a place, the majority of the taps are full strength IPAs, and you can't have that many, just like you expressed. So if I want a light IPA or even a light pale ale, what's the biggest challenge to brewing that?
Sure. There's no way to get around the fact that there's less alcohol. Alcohol itself is going to have a sweetness to it. It's a great solvent of aromatics. It is going to affect the mouthfeel. And there's really nothing you can do to replace that alcohol. Every once in a while, a friend of mine will say, hey, I got this fun, non-alcoholic rum or something like that. And they'll often put in a little chili powder or something like that to give it the warmth that you'd expect from a spirit. That kind of thing just really doesn't work with beer, and honestly doesn't really work with non-alcoholic spirits. So you just sort of have to take it for granted that you're not going to have that component of it. And then you have to work around that. So for example, on the malt side, you really have to be cognizant of that you're using less malt. And so you want to build in extra malt flavor, extra dextrins, extra body, using the water salts, using maybe yeast strain selection. When it comes to hopping, it's really difficult to get the same oomph from half the amount of hops. So you might want to consider using hops that are a little bit less bitter, so you can use the same amount of hops, or hops that are higher in oil, or advanced hop products where we use an extract at the brewery for some of our pale ales from hop steiner called Salvo that is debittered. So it's something similar to like Incognito, but without the alpha acid. And so that's, again, a way that we can get in more hop compounds, more hop flavor, but without balancing the beer. If we're taking away half the alcohol, we can't have 90 IBUs. We want to have that 45 IBUs, but in the same breath, we don't want to cut the hop aromatics in half or the hop flavor compounds in half. And we'll get into all that stuff as this goes on, but for a commercial brewer, it's a real challenge just because, as Charlie Papazian pointed out, a lot of Americans, buy based on ABV. And Doug was saying when we talked earlier that, and I'm sure he'll remember who it was, someone said Americans buy beer like they buy gasoline. That, people are looking for that 88 octane or that 90 octane, and that's what's, worth more money to them. And for a brewer, pulling out a little bit of alcohol, particularly if it just means that you're pulling out some sugar or you're pulling out a couple of bags of base malt, you're costing almost the same amount of money. It's the same amount of labor. It's the same amount of tank time. The losses are the same if you're dry hopping at the same rate. All those costs don't go away just because you've gone from 8% alcohol to 5% alcohol. And as a result, it can be really difficult to make a good product that is also marketable at the price point people are expecting to pay. As a brewer at a brewery that 90% of our sales are through the tasting room, it's worth it for me just to not make quite as much money on those beers. They're still profitable. I'm still doing okay selling a $6 pint on a pale ale and a $7 pint on an IPA and an $8 pint on a double IPA. But when you start talking about distribution and once we get into tasting the Bells and later the DogFish Head, we'll see how they did, trying to hit that, $10 six-pack, $12 six-pack price when you're giving 30% of that to a distributor, 30% of that to the retailer, and you're only clearing, $3 or $4 per six-pack. And that's what I'm getting more than that at the brewery for selling a single pint over the bar. So the economics of the whole thing are a little challenging sometimes.
I guess I never thought about the alcohol being sweet, but you're saying it literally leaves a sweetness on the palate?
A little bit. I was actually just having this debate with a friend of mine. Alcohol. I think everyone perceives it a little differently, and certainly once you get, if you're sipping on some tequila or something like that, it's not going to taste sweet. But I think there's something to that alcohol itself, which has an intrinsic sweetness. It's also can play tricks on you if you're just looking at your hydrometer. If a beer finishes at 1010, 2.5 Plato, and it's 2% alcohol, the residual extract, what the real amount of sugar in there is going to be less than if it's a 10% alcohol beer that finished at 1010, just because that alcohol is less dense than water, and that's going to throw your hydrometer reading lower. And so that's one of the things we always try to do for lower alcohol beers is look for lower attenuation. So we're starting lower, but not as low as you might expect. So where our double IPA might start at the low 1080s, a pale ale for us starts in the 1060s, even the mid 1060s, and we're looking for a similar final gravity So we're mashing hotter. We might be, at our scale, we really can't select a less tenuous yeast strain because we're harvesting from the pale ale to repitch into the IPA and the double IPA. But usually we're, the stronger the beer, we lower the mash temperature by a couple of degrees.
So if I back out the sweetness from the alcohol, just to move that in, I still want something that's flavorful. I want something that, doesn't end up tasting like a macro beer or, so how do you keep the flavor in, and maintain all the balance? If I was going to make a flavorful IPA, how would I do it?
Sure. For me, it really starts with the malt, because that's really the thing that you're watering down. Is by making a lower alcohol beer, you generally are starting with less malt. And base malt even just has an intrinsic flavor. When you make a barley wine, you really can just make it with 100% Maris Otter, maybe a little, 3 or 4% crystal malt or something like that, just because you're adding so much malt that it's going to be malty. And when you make a lower alcohol beer, sometimes you have to use, say, a higher percentage of specialty malt. You might use something like a Golden Naked Oats that is going to have a nutty, toasty flavor. You might think about switching out some of your base malt rather than just using American 2-row brewer's malt, something that is 1 or 2 SRM, not a lot of toastiness. Since you're using a lot less of it, you might think about using English pale ale malt or a German Vienna malt, something that's going to pound for pound, because it's cooked a little bit darker, have more Maillard products, more melanoidins, more oomph to it. You can also think about, again, like one of the great things about being a home brewer is that you can be inefficient. And so usually when you mash, the first runnings are going to have the most sugar, but they'll have even more higher percentage of the proteins that add to mouthfeel, of the beta-glucans, of the melanoidins. And so one thing to do is to do a party guile, so a split batch, but I actually do it the opposite way that I think sort of the tradition is. So the tradition generally is that you take the strongest first runnings and you make the imperial stout, the barley wine, the strong beer. I actually think it's more effective to use the stronger first runnings, water them down, and then make your session beer, your mild, your English bitter from those first runnings. And that can just be, if you're making a 5-gallon batch, maybe just 1 or 2 gallons of those first runnings. If you water those down before the boil, you're going to have more of the proteins, more of the melanoidins. It's going to taste maltier, richer than that gravity would suggest. Brice actually has a section where they talk about doing cold mashing, and that sort of even takes this to an even further point. You don't heat the mash at all. You simply infuse the grains that you would do, say, I did with the ESB grain bill, so something you would normally make a 5 or 6% alcohol beer. You infuse them at room temperature with water. You can recirculate for an hour or 2, or you can just leave it sitting in your mash tun overnight. And then after that time, you run it off, bring it up to a boil, and what happens is you extract almost the same amount of the color, the malt flavor, the proteins, but very little of the fermentables. And so in my case, I fermented it out. It started at 1020 something. It finished in the 10 teens, and it was 2.1% alcohol, something like that. But it had great mouthfeel. It looked good. It had a nice head. And that's just a really fun technique that you can do at home for making something that is just starting with a recipe and again, it's wasteful. You're using the same amount of malt to make a beer that's 2% alcohol rather than 5 or 6. But in the grand scheme of things, an extra $10 for malt, if it means that you get a beer that you really love, that you enjoy, that you can drink more of, that you can not feel bad, having one for lunch, not feel bad having one after you get back from walking the dog or whatever, and have 2 or have 3, and rather than just having that one normal strength beer.
Well, speaking of having one, I've got one here that's getting warm. Oh, can we go ahead and play Mallet's little clip?
Sounds good.
All right. So hopefully this will work okay. I've got a short clip here from Mr. John Mallet, and we're going to be talking about Lighthearted.
Hey everybody, it's Mallet. I'm in my office at Bell's, and I'm here today with a can of Lighthearted, which is our new low-cal IPA. The beer itself has got flavor. It's got the flavor of hops. It's got some malt backbone in there. still coming in at like 110 calories. I think that works out to about the same as a banana. Then it's kind of light and refreshing. You know, the beer just drinks very easily. For me, I want a beer that's got flavor. I want a beer that's got some body in there to kind of round that thing out. I want a beer that's got this sort of great hop character, and you do need to balance that. I mean, this beer is tasting like beer. A lot of people don't drink light beer. A lot of people don't like light beer, and I would really encourage them to give this one a try. I mean, for me, it's certainly different than what we see out there otherwise. I mean, quite frankly, if you had told me that this beer was like low-cal, I don't know that I would have believed you. Actually, you seem
All
pretty
right.
believable, so.
Mr. Mallet,
Maybe I
he
wouldn't believe you.
always has a way with words. Now, first thing I noticed, Michael, and I'm going to pour mine, but my can says 4%. Ah. So they've already changed it, apparently. So we're going to start out with a nice pour here.
I muted myself. Sorry for that. Mine still says 3.7.
Now that's interesting.
So I've got a side-by-side. I got myself a regular two-hearted, and so this is the regular full-strength two-hearted, and this is the light-hearted. And they very clearly were trying to go for the same look. I'd say the head retention definitely looks a little bit better on the full-strength one. It's a little bit creamier. And if you can see that, it's sort of a little bit coarser, big bubble on that, but it's, you know, honestly not bad. It looks better than the head on some of the beers we make at Sapwood. It definitely has, like, there's I mean, we sort of have to transport ourselves back in time a little bit. This is not the sort of IPA that most breweries are brewing anymore. This is definitely a much more malt-focused IPA. It's got toasty notes. It's more bready. It definitely isn't the just sort of hazy, juicy New England thing that has sort of taken over. And a lot of
But you
that
know,
is
the
those beers don't
aromatics,
hold up well.
the hop aromatics on it are just phenomenal. I mean, it smells almost like a juicy. Wow, they always do such a fabulous job. But I can't believe, so your can says 3.7, my can says 4.
Well, I wonder if yours is fresher than mine. I think mine says that it's hard to read the thing. I think it says it was canned in April. So mine has like a little bit of a piney hop kind of thing, but definitely isn't as fruity and bright and orangey as it can be. And so the
Mine
full
is
strength,
pretty
full hearted,
phenomenal.
two hearted is 7% in comparison. Yeah, so it's also a little unfair. My two hearted is 2 months fresher than my light hearted. I'd say the two hearted, you can clearly tell a difference. It definitely is sweeter, more caramel forward. It's more bitter as well. So clearly they cut down the bitterness in lighthearted. I think maybe even more so than maybe they needed to.
So there it is, 4%. Isn't that wow? I cannot read this date code. It is.
Yeah, mine's kind of smudged.
Mine's unreadable. Well, I think this one is pretty fresh because the hops are just stunningly beautiful. Love this beer, and it's very drinkable. I'll take that "but" out of it. It is very drinkable.
Yeah, for me, there's almost no way you can lighten a beer as much as they have and not have it be noticeable. I think with really good technique and the right recipe formulation, you could maybe trick someone into thinking a beer is 1.5, maybe 2% more alcohol. There's no way you can make a 3.7% or a 4% beer taste like a 7% beer. There's just, it's lighter, it's crisper, it's not a bad beer. But I think if you had this at a table when you were judging IPAs, you'd just go, it's a little thin, it's not quite as rich, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it would be asking them an impossible task to make it, particularly trying to make it a scale where they're distributing it and still making some money on it. I think there are a lot of sort of things we can talk about in terms of like hop character, and they've done a pretty good job. Honestly, those standard two heart is a little hoppier in the nose, but not a lot. And it'd be really interesting to know sort of what they did. If I mean, for us, it's a lot of just using the same amount of dry hops we normally would. If an IPA has 3 or 4 pounds per barrel of dry hops, which is the same as You double that, it's like 6 to 8 ounces in a 5-gallon batch. No, I'm sorry, it's the other way. It's 3 or 4. You do, is it half of that per gallon? I think it's half of this. So it's like 1.5 to 2 ounces per gallon. So most of our beers are in that kind of range of for 5 gallons, 7 to 10 ounces, something like that. That's what we do for our 5% and our 4.5% pale ales and session IPAs. That
So
we don't
let's move
pull
into
those punches.
mouthfeel, because that was what you immediately said. I think if I had these and I was judging these, this couldn't fool me because of the mouthfeel. So, but it's not an unpleasant mouthfeel. And many times you get beers that are substandard and they're watery. So how did they do that? How did they preserve the mouthfeel in this, or make it as good as they could?
I'd guess at least part of it is water chemistry. One of the sort of more interesting experiments I did was to take the water I was going to brew with, and I sent it to Ward Labs to get it analyzed, and then I sent the finished beer to Ward Labs to see how those water minerals changed. And I was really surprised. And again, it's just from the malt. So, for example, I measured the chloride, which is a pretty important mouthfeel sort of positive compound. I had 262 parts per million in my brewing water with my salts added. When the beer came back, it was 448. So I almost got double the amount of chloride. And if you're going to make a beer with less malt, you're also going to get less salts, less chloride, less sulfate, less sodium from the grain. And so it makes a lot of sense to push up your water salt additions. In the lower the alcohol beer, the more I would increase my additions. That's like one of the little sort of takeaways that we do is, again, adjust based on what the beer is going to be. And a beer that is really low alcohol is going to need more chloride in particular. You could certainly add a little more sodium too. I think sodium can be really beneficial in terms of accenting malt flavor. I mean, salt makes everything taste better. Everything from chocolate cake to basically anything savory has a little bit of salt in it. And so I think a little bit of sodium chloride, a little bit of table salt, or a little bit of another thing, if you're making a stout, a little bit of baking soda, sodium bicarbonate can really help. But otherwise, I think for malts, I don't know if they're doing it, but you could think about adding other grains that are higher in protein. So for example, something like spelt, something like oats, something like rye. All of those have a really outsized benefit to mouthfeel and body. And so if you're able to, increasing the percentages of those by taking down, moving some of your base malt out, but then adding maybe even more than a standard recipe would have. So not only holding the percentage the same, but even maybe increasing the percentage of, again, those higher protein adjunct grains, I would tend to eliminate. And I don't know if, say, Two Hearted maybe has some sugar in it. Maybe not. I don't know. That's the first thing I would pull out. If you're brewing a Belgian triple and you want to make a lighter version, if you're making a West Coast double IPA and you want to make a lighter version, I'd pull out the table sugar, the glucose, the sucrose, anything like that is going to be really just adding fermentables, but no protein, no body, no aromatics. Get that stuff out of there. And then sort of a second tier, I'd start thinking about reducing the amount of rice, corn, again, adjuncts that maybe aren't adding as much oomph. Those would be good things to think about eliminating. You could certainly be mashing hotter. I would bet that I don't think that the final gravities are the same on these two, but if I had to guess, I would bet that where it's about half the alcohol, I'm sure the final gravity isn't half the final gravity. So I'm sure that they added a little bit more malt. Maybe they added mashed a little bit warmer, that sort of thing. You could certainly think about adding something like maltodextrin, but honestly, in most cases, I think you're lactose. I think you're better off adding more malt and mashing hotter to get more flavor, more character. Something like lactose or maltodextrin can be a good sort of adjustment post-fermentation. If a beer really does dry out too much, you can boil it a little up with your priming sugar, or boil it up and put it into a keg and add to the beer. But that water you're adding is also then diluting malt flavor and hop compounds and all those sorts of things. So I don't know what Bell's is doing, but clearly it's worked well for them.
Well, and it's a flavorful beer, but I think it's real interesting. We discovered at the moment that they were advertising 3.7 and they've raised it to 4. Now, I don't know if that's a perception problem for people or whether they actually did it for the flavor or the mouthfeel of the beer. What would you think if you were on the Bell's team and there was a reason to raise it to 4? What would you guess it would be?
If it was a smaller brewery, I would just assume that it was this batch finished a little drier, started a little higher. Big breweries this size don't make mistakes like that. They often are, and this may be fermented at a higher gravity. So they may be literally making a beer that's 7 or 8% alcohol and then watering it down to get to right on target, right on spec with their alkalizer. Perception very much could be a thing, although it's a weird question on a beer like this where the selling point is that it's lower calorie or lower alcohol. And I wonder too, this one doesn't list, it says it's a low-cal IPA, but I don't think it actually says, maybe it did on the 6-pack. I think it says 10, 105, 110. It could be that they changed their calorie target and they decided it was worth it to be a little bit stronger, to have a little bit more body, a little bit more mouthfeel. Or it could be that they decided that they were going to dry it out a little bit more, that rather than having it be 4% alcohol or 3.7%, that they could dry it out because the residual carbohydrates are going to add to the calorie count as well as the body and the mouthfeel can, that they were happier with starting at the same gravity, drying it out a little bit more, and having that alcohol be maybe not quite as much of a detraction. Because this one is really being sold on as low calorie rather than low alcohol. And so having more calories for the same amount of alcohol for some people is a selling point. Not for me, obviously. And so I do wonder if they started with the same gravity and decided that they could dry it out a little bit more than they were and get more alcohol for fewer calories. And that would help it to sell more, because someone looking for a low calorie, they're often looking for as much alcohol as they can get for that number of calories. That there are people who have the vodka and soda just because the only calories are from the alcohol. Alcohol itself has calories. There's no way around that. But the more residual sweetness you have in there, the more empty calories you have that may just be contributing to flavor and body and mouthfeel, but not to the alcohol.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, if we were brewing this as a home brew, and you said your guess was they brewed it at a much higher gravity and then watered it down, what would we need to do to homebrew and get one to turn out as good as half-hearted?
Honestly, if they are doing that, it would really be, I would think, mostly a cost-cutting measure that would allow you to, Bell's is gigantic. They have 1,000-barrel tank. You could end up starting with 1,000 barrels and a full day of brewing to do 5 turns on their 200-barrel system or wherever they have. And then at the end of the process, you could end up with double that amount. You could end up with, with some losses, 1,800 barrels or something like that. Just to put that in context, my brewery did 1,000 barrels last year, 1,200, something like that. And places like Bell's have single tanks that are, more than our entire annual production. I don't think that that's necessary. There definitely are some people who, for like making hard seltzer and things like that, people advocate that you do increase the amount of fusels and some of the esters and some things like that. Initially, if you're making a 15, 16, 18% base, but then when you dilute it down to 5 or 6%, you're diluting those out lower than they would have been otherwise. So it can actually make a cleaner product. Honestly, though, for something like this, I think for yeast, you often run into the problem where you're not getting enough yeast character, because every time a yeast cell eats a molecule of sugar, it's making alcohol, but it's also producing byproducts, which are esters, which are fruity. They could be phenols, which are spicy and clovey in a Belgian beer or something like that. I would think you'd actually want to increase ester production. So, for example, for when we brew lower alcohol beers, we tend to start them at a warmer temperature. So if we're using something like Conan or something like the Boddington strain, London 3, we'll pitch and ferment right from the beginning in the low 70s. Where for a double IPA, in particular triple IPA, we might start it way down in the mid 60s, let it grow slowly, let it be cleaner, less boozy. It's pretty hard unless you're really not fermenting if you don't have temperature control, to make a 3.7% beer taste boozy. And in fact, like having just a little hint of alcohol or something like that may actually help to sell that it's a stronger beer than it is. I would look at using strains, the Kviks, the Sactois, the strains that are going to make an outsized impact when you're making a smaller beer. I doubt Bell's is doing that. Almost certainly they're using the same yeast strain, again, just for like economic reasons. It's a lot easier to harvest from the 3.7% beer and pitch bright, healthy, great yeast cells into the 7% IPA and harvest from there and pitch into another IPA or into the double IPA or into the barley wine or the imperial stout. So I guess I would say I wouldn't be too concerned about mimicking their process. I would try to do what sort of homebrewing is best at, which is to optimize things and to make the trade-offs you're willing to make. Whereas they're making trade-offs based on price points and things like that, you can make them based on, if $5 more malt is worth a little bit more flavor, if you really do want to get every last little bit out of that malt. If you do that, I would still this is the kind of time where you might want to think about monitoring the gravity or the pH of your final runnings. Beers like this tend to, if you sparge them too much, that's when you can start getting the astringency. This is super duper clean. It doesn't have a roughness on the tongue. It doesn't have that tannic thing that you sometimes get that's like licking a tea bag. They are clearly doing a very good job controlling their water chemistry. They might be, like we do, acidifying their sparge water to help reduce the amount of tannins extracted. And again, just a big brewery tends to have those sorts of best practices dialed in. And John's a really talented guy and a really smart guy. And he's been doing this for probably longer than I've been alive. I'm pretty sure that he's been brewing. So, clearly he's not going to make rookie mistakes. But as a home brewer, these are the kinds of beers you really have to tighten up your process on. Avoid over sparging, avoid sparging really hot or anything like that. And you should be able to get results as good as this.
Yeah, I'm sure if he makes a rookie mistake, you and I would never get it. Well, speaking of that, why don't we switch gears and go to the DogFish head, Slightly Mighty, because I think Sam played some tricks with his, maybe a little different approach than Bell's did. That
Sounds
work
good.
for you?
Now, I'll say one of my sort of key points on what beer I like more is if they're both in front of me, what do I drink more of? And I drink a lot more of the lighthearted. It really is. It's a more drinkable, bright beer. Honestly, I just don't have the taste for sort of the sweeter caramelly notes in an IPA more, and the lighthearted is really refreshing. And as I'm talking, it's what I want to be drinking rather than the full strength one.
Yeah, it is. It is very easy drinking. Well, I have a short video from Sam Calagione. And by the way, those of you that are in the Carolinas or in the Southeast, I found out that Sam is actually going to be at the North Carolina Brewers Guild Conference in November. I think it's November 12th. I'm going to be there, hopefully spending a little time and getting an interview with Sam. And he's also promised to do some other things with us in November. So if you're around North Carolina, it's at Winston-Salem, and we can see Sam there. But meanwhile, let's see what we can get from Sam here. And this is his Slightly Mighty.
Hey guys, Sam Calagione here. Just got done with one of my sports. I'm here today to talk to you about Slightly Mighty, a beer that is slight in calories and carbs, but mighty in hop character. Most light beers are very watery and totally lack body, but not Slightly Mighty. It packs in the flavor at only 3.6 carbs and 95 calories. How did we do it? It's all about the monk fruit, which lets us pack in the flavor without adding on calories and carbs. But what's it look like? Beautiful, hazy, golden straw color with a powdery white head. So aromatically, you pick up tons of tropical hops in the nose. And for flavor, a beautiful balance between the nice body that the monk fruit brings it and that muscular hop profile that sits on top of it. So find Slightly Mighty everywhere you buy indie craft beer, on draft, in cans, and if they don't have it, say, what's up? You need to carry Slightly Mighty. Cheers.
I did the
Looks
same
like
thing
you
again. I've got a Dogfish Head 60 mint. Clearly not trying to do the same thing, but I thought it'd be interesting to try their 2 IPAs.
Just without spilling it. Got an odd angle there, and that's a bit lighter in color. Beautiful beer. Get that turned around.
I honestly, I kind of wish I went into this without knowing it had. So monk fruit is essentially a natural artificial sweetener. It's in the same sort of categories like stevia. To me, it's sort of the finish is sort of weird. It has that not quite diet soda, but that like it.
Yeah, the aromatics don't even compare. At least mine. I get almost no hop aroma versus what I got out of that lighthearted.
Yeah, I would say to me it's like a fruitier thing, but it has like there's like a more unpleasant kind of like a overripe or like a slightly rotten tropical kind of thing.
And that's a little rough. Overly ripe.
It's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, this is interesting. I don't think it has as pleasant a mouthfeel. The hop aromatics are not even the same league. And there's a little bit of a bitter finish that I don't know that I like. I mean, I don't want to beat it up. It's a nice beer. I'd be proud if I brewed it. But just comparing the two, and I'll put them on the camera. There's quite a color difference. I have not polished mine off like you have.
I only brought down 2 glasses.
Oh, okay. So the full one, and I'll top that off, is the Slightly Mighty. It does look like it's got a little bit of lacing on it and kind of gets a pretty head. And it's obviously considerably lighter than the lighthearted. Quite a big color difference, quite a big mouthfeel difference, quite a big, they're quite different. Do you think, Mike, that's the monk fruit? Or, I mean, it's certainly not the difference in the hop flavor.
No, I think they were very much going for different things. I think Dogfish Head was trying to do as hazy a beer as they could because hazy IPAs are the thing now. When you compare, so this is the 60 minute. I mean, obviously you can see me right through there. Yeah. Versus that one. Whereas Bell's was trying to make a lighter version of their sort of flagship IPA. Dogfish Head clearly in their messaging and the appearance was trying to make something with a different appeal. And there's nothing right or wrong with either of those things. But you can also see how much better the lacing is on the 60 minute compared to this one. That you're right, it's got a couple little bits on it, but it really fell off quick. And that can be a malt selection thing that the less malt you have in there, the less protein. You might want to think about adding some chit malt from Best or some Carafoam from Wireman or some Carapils from Breeze, something that's going to help with head and body and foam.
So what's the date code on yours?
If you're making
Mine
a lighter
says
beer.
January 2024 of the Slightly Mighty. So I would think that means it's pretty fresh.
Mine says that as well. I would hope it's a 6-month Best Buy. I've run into it a couple times, and it's more on imports, but I know Pilsner Urquell does a full year. I bought one that was 5 months from the Best Buy, and it was pretty awful. And I assumed it was really fresh because they couldn't possibly have a year Best Buy on a Pilsner. I don't know what Dogfish Head is doing. That's one of the reasons I really dislike the Best Buy date. It really sort of takes away my ability as a consumer to make a judgment.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I was wondering, just the hops now in the lighthearted, it pretty well all gone away. they flashed off, and now I can mostly just smell malt. But it was a beautiful beer when I opened it. So I was wondering if that was a freshness thing between the two
Certainly
beers.
could be.
Yeah. Well, I will actually ask Sam to bring some so we can talk.
Bring it as fresh as possible. But yeah, and honestly, that's it's not a bad idea to think about ways to build in, hop aroma or fruitiness or whatever in these lower alcohol beers. There's just only so much you can do. There's only so many hops you can add. We do a lot of sort of advanced hop product stuff. We'll use cryo hops because those are more concentrated aromatics. We'll do hop extracts that, in addition to 3 or 4 pounds per barrel, we're then sometimes on top of that adding like CO2 supercritical hop extracts. Again, trying to find ways around the fact that you don't have the alcohol, because the alcohol is what helps to pull out the aromatics from the hops. And so if you're starting with 3.5% alcohol rather than 9.5% alcohol, alcohol is a solvent. I mean, that's why there's alcohol in vanilla extract. That's why there's alcohol as a flavor molecule in a lot of things. Essentially, a lot of spirits are just neutral distilled spirits aged in oak. They're really just a solvent taking out toasted oak aromatics. And so by using a hop extract for aromatics, someone has done that hard work. They have solubilized those hop aromatics, and then you can add them. And now you're not at a disadvantage that you have lower alcohol. And I would also guess that that's something that these bigger breweries are doing. Again, saving on losses. Every time you dry hop, the hops suck up volume that you're not going to get into a package. It takes time. You have the risk of adding astringency. You have the risk of adding more bitterness from the alpha acids. Even if they don't isomerize, they can still add bitterness. And so I bet a lot of these places, I know it's very common for non-alcoholic beers to add hop extracts as sort of the primary. As a small brewery, we are a both and sort of situation where we want to add as much hop as we can physically in pellets and cryo. And then sometimes on top of that, we'll add additional hop isolates. And it's just, we want as much as possible. And a lot of these hop processors try to sell it to us as cost savings. We say we're not trying to save money. We're trying to get the hoppiest beer, the most intense aromatics, and that's not something that's happening in these cases. They're adding that as a time savings, cost savings, that sort of thing.
So, Michael, what do you think? I think that leads into nicely, especially the contrast that we had between these two beers. What do you think are kind of your top tips on achieving flavor depth and complexities? I think in the case of these two beers, Bell's pulled it off better. If they were intended to be similar, Bell's pulled it off better than DogFish.
I think partly what worked for Bell's is they leaned into the malt. I think to me the DogFish head is lacking the maltiness, and since it doesn't also have hoppiness or doesn't also have something else, it's sort of lacking. Where the Bell's, at least, there's a little bit of a toasty caramel thing that we're sort of missing in the DogFish head. I think they're just, honestly, those are the styles I think that do better at low alcohol. I'd much rather, Guinness is notoriously, people say it's a meal in a glass, and part of that's the nitro, and part of that's the perception that, stouts and dark beer are, thicker and sweeter, but Guinness has fewer calories than Bud Light or Miller Lite or whatever it is. And it's all, 3% alcohol, and people don't even notice that. We didn't really even talk about nitro, but that's a really fun idea too for lower alcohol beers. I think leaning into malt, because malt is associated just in your brain with sweetness and bread and filling and rich in a way that fruity, hop, bright sort of flavors aren't. So I really think sort of the best session beers tend to be the ones that are like malt, have a good amount of malt, or have, like say, yeast driven again, something sour like a Berliner Weiss. Really picking a sort of signature character that's going to give you a little bit more character, oomph, something. It's just really hard if you have to pinch your pennies on the hops to make the hops the star, again, on a beer that's not being sold for as much as a normal beer. And again, even more so if you're distributing. As a home brewer, and honestly, my tip is don't be a cheapskate. Use as much malt, as much hops, as much as much water, salt. Don't try to save money by making a low alcohol beer. Try to use all of the tools at your disposal to make as flavorful, as characterful, as rich, as nuanced a beer as possible. So again, a variety of more characterful malts, using a lot of hops at a lot of different stages, we love Cascade, we love Crystal hops. So rather than adding, say your normal recipe calls for 4 ounces of Mosaic and Simcoe in the whirlpool for an IPA. Rather than just adding 2 ounces of Mosaic and Simcoe in the whirlpool and getting half the IBUs and half the hop flavor, I'd still add 4 ounces, but use a hop that's half the alpha acid. So using 4 ounces of Cascade, or 2 ounces of Cascade, 2 ounces of Crystal, which have almost the same sort of oil profile, although not quite as much as some of the sort of cooler hops, but they have a lot of the same compounds. You might even consider using more of them. You might even consider using 6 ounces of Cascade and Crystal to hit the same IBUs because they're 3, 4, 5, 6% alpha acid rather than 17, 18, 19% like some of the newer varieties. Using more of everything to really make a beer that is as flavorful. The goal isn't just to water down a beer. If that's what you want to do, you can do that. I would use more malt, mash hotter, finish higher, cut the IBUs, but leave as much hop flavor, as much nuance as you can in there. And you can make a better session IPA than anyone else can when they're trying to hit that price point in the distribution game.
So if Sam said, "Hey, heard you were on Gourmet Brewing and you didn't like my beer as well as Mallet's," what suggestions would you have for Sam if he said, "Okay, what would you do, Michael?"
There's no suggestion. I mean, he knows what his price point is, and he knows who he's marketing to. He has a lot more brewing scientists, a lot smarter people than me. I'm just lucky I don't have to compete with them. That's like not the goal of being a small brewer. And I'm sure he knows that how he would do it if price was no object. And this is the same thing that sort of all breweries go through. Certainly when he was running his own show before they were bought by Boston Beer, there'd be real differences between what they would do for that pilot batch of something to try out unique ingredients, and then the compromises they would have to make to scale that recipe up to something that they were going to brew for national distribution. For the small batch, you can use the weird, wild, even at my scale. Every Thursday we tap sort of a weird one-off thing. And for that, I just view, $75 for saffron or geisha coffee or some super weird, unique, one-off vanilla bean from some obscure island I've never heard of, or black truffles we've used. That all works in one keg, 5 gallons, 10 gallons. We're selling, 4 or 5 ounce pours over the bar. It's advertising. People come in to try the weird, unique, one-off thing. I get to learn something. But that's not necessarily something we're then going to make into a 10 or a 20 barrel batch and have on for a month and try to send, 20 cases out to distribution. It just, the finances don't work. And so to me, it's sort of like asking, what could Stouffer's learn from a 2-star Michelin restaurant? Stouffer's has a lot more money, a lot more research, a lot more PhDs, a lot more buying power, but they're not trying to compete with the 2-star Michelin restaurant. The 2-star Michelin restaurant is, their goal is to make the best food possible. Stouffer's goal is to make the most money selling food to as many people as possible. And there's just no real connection on those things. And sometimes we have overlaps and we can talk about stuff, but my personal attitude is that I don't feel nearly as much connection to Boston Beer or Sierra Nevada or Bell's as I think they should with Coors and Miller and Bud. That's their scale. They're all trying to compete for nationwide distribution, being on tap in every airport, every bowling alley, every chain restaurant. I view my peers as the people who the owner is still the guy, cleaning kegs at least once in a while in my case, or Speaking of South Carolina, I was just down at a local farmers market I work with, buying muscadine grapes for a beer that I'm going to do. That had just come off the truck from South Carolina 2 days ago. He said, that's what I love. That's what I think beer is good at. I make low alcohol beers because it's what I want to drink, not because it's what the marketing department has decided is the biggest growth area for beer growth or whatever it is. I was just at my parents' house in Massachusetts, and a plane flew overhead with a DogFish Head banner about their new vodka and soda canned cocktails. So, I mean, I get it. I mean, he's a smart guy. He's a good marketer, and he's done very well for himself. And he gave an invaluable boost to the excitement of craft beer, the idea of what craft beer could be. But what they're doing right now is it's fine.
It sounds like, as you've described, low alcohol, light table beers, if I can run all those words together, those phrases, is not for the faint of heart as a brewer. You got to really, I mean, I heard a kind of backwards party guile or inverted party guile. You've thrown around a lot of minerals and salts we need to be thinking about. If you were to summarize it, though, what are some of the key 1, 2, 3 things that you would focus in on if you're going to produce a low ABV version, I guess, of a style beer, a light IPA or a light pale ale? My audience is particularly interested in a table beer or small beer that mimics a pale ale.
Sure. So I would say focus on having the malt be as characterful as you want it to be. So, for example, in our double IPAs, we'll mix in a little bit of Pilsner malt just to lighten them up. We have direct fire, the beer can get a little bit dark, and when you have that much malt, it's a bigger concern. But for the pale ales, we'll often even go the opposite way. Rather than having a little Pilsner malt, we'll add a little pale ale malt. Because we've got less malt in there total, we want to build in extra oomph to that malt flavor. We'll up the amount of oats, we might add more wheat, we might add a higher percentage of a chit malt or a carafoam, something that's going to give you more head retention, better foam, because we want that beer to look as good as it tastes. For hops, we try to get in as much or more total volumes of hops, and we use advanced hop products. We're not cutting corners. We are sort of increasing the amount of hops, if anything, for a lot of them. Because you don't have that alcohol that's a solvent, we're increasing water salts, so more calcium chloride in particular is very helpful for body and mouthfeel, maybe some sodium. For the yeast, we're using sort of a characterful strain. We're fermenting a little bit warm. We're trying to push ester production. We're trying to increase the amount of yeast character we have in there so it doesn't taste watered down or sort of light. We're trying to build in extra body with higher mash temperature, maybe not as low as starting gravity as you'd expect. And sort of all of that combines to sort of having a beer that really what you're looking for is that everything's exactly the same as the stronger beer, just with less alcohol. You're not trying to dilute out everything else to the same amount that you're diluting the alcohol. You want to just dilute the alcohol, nothing else. So again, sort of made the synergy, or the example would be if you're making a soup. If you're making a soup and you want to make it low calorie, you wouldn't cut the amount of salt in half. You wouldn't cut the amount of vegetables in half because they're sort of already low in calories. You'd just be looking for like, hey, maybe I can pull out a little bit of the olive oil. Maybe I can pull a little of the meat out. And maybe, hey, I could add back some of that instant bouillon that is going to give me that flavor without actually having to have the whole chuck roast in there or whatever it is. And that's really what I'm trying to do with these beers. I'd also say that for like a lot of other beers, like just go for something that's already a lower, lighter beer. Making an Irish dry stout, a Berliner Weiss, a Saison that finishes really dry. The sort of traditional, a lot of the Czech 10p lagers, there are already styles that are designed around this that sort of lean into that lower alcohol. And explore what the world of session beers that's already out there is, even if they're not called light or table or whatever. Sometimes they're just called beer, and that's fine too. There are some styles that 4.5% alcohol is full strength, and oftentimes those are better than a light double IPA or something like that.
So I think I'm hearing essentially the same amount of everything except fermentables.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's pretty
and
well
in some cases, more of the stuff, more water salts to make up for the fact that you have less malt, and some of those salts come from malt. Maybe even more hops, depending on what varieties. Picking lower alpha acid varieties rather than the full, high alpha ones. But really, it's I would make light beer because I like drinking more beer, not because I was trying to save money. I really think that sometimes you're better off having, honestly, I think I drink more alcohol when I have really light options available. It's easy to drink 2 really crisp light lagers than 1 really thick, heavy imperial stout. Sometimes that imperial stout, I end up drinking half of it and forgetting about it because it's, it doesn't lead you on to that next sip. You make a perfect session beer. It's easy to drink one and then go, I'll have another one. And then half an hour later, I'm thirsty again. I'll have one of those, particularly this time of year when it's hot in summertime. It's put a big peanut butter imperial stout in front of me and I'll have 3 sips of it and I'm done with it.
And you shouldn't look at it or expect a cost savings because from a brewing point of view, it's maybe more effort than a big beer.
I would say it's at least the same amount of effort. And particularly, as a home brewer, like if you love it and you love the hobby, I think I liked it. When I was a home brewer, I liked brewing. I didn't mind making something that was a little bit lighter. And again, you can think about the party guile thing where you could get, 2 different batches out of the same brew day. So you could have one beer, take the first gallon or 2, dilute it down and make a mild or a English bitter, and then just keep sparging, keep collecting, boil. You could add some malt extract or some sugar, and then make something that is more characterful. And then have one to drink fresh, one to age. I used to do a lot of that stuff as a home brewer. I would split a batch and do halves a Pilsner, halves a Brett Saison. There are a lot of sort of fun things you can do with a split batch as a home brewer. It's difficult to do as a professional brewer where we only have one kettle. And honestly, I didn't appreciate early on how valuable it was that I had write-ups for every one of those beers. And for the first year or 2, I sort of fell into the trap of just like, we have 6 or 7 beers on tap and we have a new batch every month or so, and I'll remember how these were. This is a big part of my life now. And then a couple years in, I started going, I just don't remember that beer. What did I think of that one? And now I have a 120-page document of my write-ups for every single beer we've brewed in the last 3 years, and so I can look back through it. Hey, we've done 700 beers, I think, in our 5 years, which is just ridiculous. But I'll go back and look, and really, to me, that the most important thing, if you don't record anything else, is if I brewed this beer again today, what would I change? And ideally, I try the beer next to a good example. If I'm making a double IPA, I get a Trillium, a Treehouse, and other half, something from a good local brewery that's super fresh. And I sit there and I drink both of them and I think about it and I try to look for trends. There's nothing much to say if this one's a little bit better than that one, but if, say, for a while I found that our beers were always a little bit more astringent, a little bit more harsh than almost every other beer. And we started looking at our dry hop temperature and lowering our dry hop temperature because that was something that was supposed to reduce, and Scott had been pushing for it for years, reduce tannin extraction, polyphenol extraction. But then we weren't getting as much aroma, so then we had to look into how we were agitating the beer after we dry hopped it because hops fall more quickly. And so, how do we resuspend them? But that's the kind of thing you don't notice unless you're really paying attention to your beer, sitting with it, not just having a sip and writing down the aromatics you get, but really, and again, it's honestly one of the tests I use. Which beer am I drinking more of? I might spend the first half of each beer thinking about them and analyze them analytically, but then I just want to sit there and watch something on Netflix or YouTube and just sort of notice which one gets emptied first. And again, this one's the opposite. I've been drinking a lot more of the 60 Man. I think I already refilled my glass, and not the Slightly Mighty. Almost using yourself as it's not quite a blind experiment, but sort of the Michael Jackson used to call it Moorish. What beer calls on you to have another sip of it? What beer finishes in a way that invites you to take another sip? And that's something that I think is hard to describe and hard to notice, or hard to analyze cognitively. It's something that's almost a subconscious reaction of which one do I find myself going back for? Which snack bowl gets emptied first? Which one do I keep eating even if I don't think I like it better?
Michael, this was a lot of fun. I can't wait to get into the questions. So
excellent. I'm happy if anyone has questions about other stuff. Again, we do a lot of barrel aged, sort of weird forage stuff. We do a lot of hazy double IPAs. We do a lot of, shockingly now, we've got a bunch of like top 10 rated lagers on Untappd. So I really, at this point, can answer a lot of oddball questions, a lot of technical questions. If you've got something that's unrelated to session beers or lower alcohol stuff, happy to.